Hello and welcome to my channel. Bonsoir et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and this evening I will be doing a book review for The Call of Cthulhu and Other Weird Stories by none other than H.P. Lovecraft. Now, to be clear, this is a curated anthology of some of his short stories and novellas. This is by no means a complete collection of his works, but it gives you a pretty decent selection, I think. Now, recall, if you will, that I read At the Mountains of Madness back in the month of December of 2019. That was my first ever taste of Lovecraft, and it was a pretty good one. I enjoyed the tale quite thoroughly. I mean, it wasn't anything truly revolutionary, but I enjoyed the experience, and I definitely wanted to read more, and I really sunk my teeth eagerly into this particular tome, and it did not disappoint. I will quickly plug in a video that a YouTuber I follow recently did on At the Mountains of Madness, specifically because I didn't do a separate review for that particular novella. Put it in the description. It's by an awesome YouTuber named Quinn, and he's not a booktuber, but he does content about SFF literature, most notably A Song of Ice and Fire and Dune, but he's also a big fan of Lovecraft, so I'll just link that down there. I'll also give a short biographical note. So H.P. Lovecraft was an American author, born in 1890, died in 1937, so fairly young, and never reached any kind of notoriety during his lifetime. Now, from the little I've read / heard about him, he seemed to be a pretty miserable kind of man. There was a history of mental illness, I suppose, in his family. He was homeschooled, I think, so pretty sheltered and isolated, but also very bright, very curious. He read a lot about science, geology, astronomy. He wrote astronomical columns for local papers. He did marry, but became separated from his wife at some point because that was a condition for him to go living with his aunts. He loved his native Rhode Island, had to live in New York for a while, and he hated it. He seemed a very sad character, a sad person, but also very resentful, and I think had a deep feeling of alienation towards other people. Unfortunately, that means also foreigners and, well, you know, black people, things like that. So not the most likable of men either, by any means, but I don't know, it just gives me the impression overall of someone who's really sad sack, who found some satisfaction in writing and reading about science and things like that. So he didn't reach any kind of notoriety during his lifetime. And in fact, it's only recently that he has come to be celebrated as the father of what we now call cosmic horror. Right, so let's get to the review problem. I'll start with a note about the writing. So I thought most of these stories were well written. I think H.P. Lovecraft had a very good style of writing, very descriptive, very elegant, perhaps, yeah, a bit flowery. I think some people would probably not like that. I have seen the words purple prose evoked with regards to his writing. Personally, I kind of liked it. I like these, you know, elaborate descriptions and all these nice words strung together. I mean, I like the style of writing. It's an older style of writing too. I think it denotes a certain level of education, and you know what, I enjoy that. Like I said, elaborate descriptions, evocative descriptions more importantly, like you really get the dread, the anxiety, and the creepiness of everything just through his writing. He really knows how to pick the right words to describe, you know, an abyss, a dark forest, a sense of cosmic angst, of deep alienation. I mean, he knew what he was talking about. That's also something, you know, I think he felt a lot of what he wrote about. Not directly, obviously, because I doubt he encountered big cosmic monster things, right? But the feelings that the characters experience, I think he experienced them as well. I really felt that. Now, if you'll perhaps recall a review I did for another collection of short stories in the proto-cosmic horror genre. It was The Grey God Pan and Other Stories by Arthur Machen. One of my complaints about that collection was that I thought the author didn't show enough. He suggested a lot of things, but you can really get a sense of what was going on, or what the characters were seeing or experiencing. Here, I thought there was a very, very good balance between show and tell. He leaves a lot up to the imagination, ultimately, with his evocative descriptions, but he does also know when to describe a horrific monster entity that just seriously F's with the minds of the protagonists. But yeah, it's a good balance overall. I didn't have any complaints on that front. He knew when to leave it to simple evocation and when to actually tell you what the hell was happening concretely in the story. Now, one caveat is that while I do think the writing is of a high level and is quite beautiful, quite elegant, very evocative, very descriptive, sometimes some of the formulas he uses, some of the sentences, some of the adjectives he uses to describe a dark abyss or the depth of the ocean or depths of space, etc., they do get a bit repetitive sometimes. I mean, there are lots of stories in this collection. That's also why I picked this edition. But I mean, sometimes I was like, I already went through this kind of story with these kinds of descriptions, which is already something I noticed with At the Mountains of Madness. So sometimes these formulas do get a bit repetitive. But overall, I was still very happy with the writing. Now, most of you probably already know, and I've stated it outright, H.P. Lovecraft is known as the father of cosmic horror, or even perhaps modern horror, I'm not sure, but cosmic horror definitely. So that is the general flavour of this collection, obviously, but still there are different types of stories. It's mostly short stories, but then you've got like 2 or 3 longer short stories that might even be classified as novellas. I would say there were like 3 big subtypes of stories. You have like the story of a family that is somewhat cursed. Like there's a creepy family secret that the last person of that family or a long lost descendant stumbles upon, and when they realize what that secret is, they lose their minds basically. It does not end well for them. There's no happily ever after. That just does not happen. You have obviously all the stories of, you know, an anthropologist, an archaeologist, someone interested in folklore or esoterica, or even sometimes a scientist that just comes to discover arcane lost knowledge, forbidden knowledge, and upon discovering that knowledge, once again, they lose their minds and they're often driven to suicide, which is very cheerful stuff. And then finally, I think the third category of stories, they're more like classical Gothic stories. I think these perhaps exemplify some of his earlier writing, because I think those are more in the vein of what you'd already seen in the 19th century with people like Edgar Allan Poe or Arthur Machen and other names in the genre. Things like, I don't know, a monster or a revenant coming to terrorize a village, or a man stumbling upon a dream world and finding creepy things, like Dr. Frankenstein type stories. I mean, he still puts his own twist on them, like there's a strong focus on science, and I'll get back to that. But I think those had already been done in a way. They're less like uniquely Lovecraftian. And I use that word Lovecraftian, which has become part of, you know, common, or at least SFF literary parlance, right? We say of something, oh, it's Lovecraftian horror. Well, yeah, obviously this collection features a lot of the stories that belong to the Cthulhu mythos, or more generally the old ones / deep ones mythos, that have to do with these old books like the Necronomicon and the Pnakotic manuscripts and the Plateau of Leng and those things. And there's like I can't remember his name, but like an Arab scholar. So that crops up a lot. You've got Dagon, you've got the Call of Cthulhu, you've got the Shadow over Innsmouth, the Whisper in Darkness, and of course you have At the Mountains of Madness. All those stories belong to the same kind of crafted universe with these big, monstrous alien entities and then smaller alien civilizations that have been to Earth thousands of years before humans emerged out of the primordial ooze and things like that. So, you know, the Lovecraftian stuff, the uniquely Lovecraftian stuff, there's a lot of that in there as well. Really, it's a good collection. I would strongly suggest purchasing this particular edition. And while obviously that's what I was looking for, I wanted a good overview of Lovecraft's work. Some of it does get a bit formulaic and repetitive, but at the same time, I think since the curator did a good job of alternating the different types of stories, I never really got bored. I read this over 2 weeks. I read something else at the same time. It was just a perfect formula for me. I never got bored. I was happy to read the next story, even if I was like, oh, okay, this is getting back to the Cthulhu stuff, or no, this is going to be a bit different. So overall, like I said, a good choice. Since this is an anthology, I'm not really going to go into any kind of character analysis, but I can talk about the types of protagonists the author chooses to tell his stories, and the types of characters correspond to more or less the types of stories I just talked about. So in the case of like these cursed family narratives, the main character usually is, well, like the heir to that family or the last member of that family, or someone who's just interested in knowing more about their genealogical data. That's the case for The Shadow over Innsmouth. For the stories that are more about, stumbling across forbidden knowledge, usually they're like educated men of a certain level of learning, who've gone to university, they're anthropologists or archaeologists, or just, men of learning who are interested in local folklore and literature, in esoterica, and they've studied this on their own time because that's what interests them. In a few stories, you do have like the mad scientist type who messes around with life and death and the creepy consequences of that. And then I guess also you have the figure of the lone traveler or like the lone tradesman, like in The Color Outer Space, which was my favorite story. I mean, it's basically like a land assessor. He's someone who works for like a major waterworks company, and he needs to warn the inhabitants that they're going to flood an area to make a dam and things like that. And he stumbles across the local law. So it's all these kinds of figures. And what's common to a lot of them is a sense of growing dread, growing anxiety. Sometimes it's there from the beginning, at other times it just develops over the course of the story, and you have a sense of alienation, like I said, of just being massively freaked out and alone. And I think, to be honest, that reflects the author in this case. Like, I've talked about, death of the author, separating the art from the artist. But in this case, I do think there's a lot of the artist in the art. Like I said, H.P. Lovecraft was not a happy camper by any means, and I think you can kind of see it in some of the characters. The sense of alienation in particular. It goes with the sense of, like, cosmic dread and existential horror, but there's something actually pretty depressed about it too. I mean, this is not light reading, but it's entertaining as well. But I guess as someone who has to dealt with mental illness quite a bit in my life, I can sort of pick up the signs, And also, they're all educated white men, let's be clear. They're all basically wasps, because a lot of these stories take place in New England. There's a lot of mention of like the classical Protestant stock, and so wasps, right? And of course, they're men. There are no female protagonists. Though, while there is a smidge of racism and xenophobia, didn't really detect that much sex and misogyny, so I guess that's a plus. If you want an in-depth analysis of Lovecraft's work, there's great content out there. I'm just going to talk about the themes I picked in this specifically. It kind of also goes for At the Mountains of Madness, so you can chuck that in there if you want. Right, first theme, obviously, is this theme of there's a greater reality out there that human minds cannot encompass, cannot understand, cannot ultimately deal with. And I mean, this is a running pattern in the book. All the sorry sods who stumble upon alien species among us, or arcane knowledge, or these old ones, these old entities like Cthulhu. I mean, they either kill themselves, just go insane and get shoved in a mental asylum, or just die of sheer horror. The interesting thing, though, is that this is also a theme in The Great God Pan and Other Stories by Arthur Machen. But whereas his interpretation of that particular theme is that there's a greater spiritual reality, that science cannot explain everything, there's this weird esoteric occult woo stuff out there. In the case of Lovecraft, it's all actually based in material reality. It's materialistic. It's atheistic. There's nothing spiritual about this. There's nothing ultimately religious about this. I mean, a lot of it is camouflaged in the language of religion, but it's just, primitive human beings worshipping these massive alien entities which they mistake for gods. And in a way, they're so beyond human comprehension that they are, functionally speaking, akin to gods in a way. That's what's interesting. H.P. Lovecraft was an atheist. He was also an amateur scientist. I mean, he was very interested in science. Like I said, he wrote astronomy columns. He read a lot about geology and chemistry. I mean, he was interested in this, and you can see that reflected in some of his stories. Like, you could see he had a basic grasp of a few scientific concepts, at least for the time. So that's pretty neat. You think it's supernatural, but ultimately it's not supernatural. It's like extra natural. It's natural, but on a scale just so beyond what our puny human little brains can understand that it appears to be divine or demonic, depending how you choose to look at it. So something like Cthulhu is a creature, and I mean, can you call that an animal? I don't know. Just a creature that comes from the void at the edge of the universe. Like I said, functionally speaking, how's that really different from a god? Well, I mean, it didn't create planet Earth, and you could worship it, and it seems to have powers like it can invade the dreams of human beings. That seems supernatural, but it can also fall within the domain of science fiction. And actually, I think some of his stories fall within science fiction. It's science fiction horror more than fantasy horror, if you see what I mean. And some stories are just straight up science fiction, honestly. I mean, science fiction horror, but science fiction. The Color Out of Space is science fiction. I mean, it's weird, scary science fiction, a la The Southern Reach by Jeff Vandermeer. And in fact, one of the reasons I absolutely wanted an edition that included The Color Out of Space is because I read that The Color Out of Space was one of the sources of inspiration for the Southern Reach trilogy. And yeah, I can completely see it. And that's partly why it was my favorite story in the collection. Some stories do seem to belong to like the more traditional supernatural horror genre. Like there's a story about reanimating corpses. So even then, it is presented with a scientific aspect. Like they're saying there is no such thing as life beyond death. There's no soul, but if you reanimate the brain just after the body has ceased functioning, you can, well, reanimate the matter that gives rise to consciousness. So it's a very materialistic interpretation of the phenomenon. But even in the case of a story that seems to feature a vampire-like entity, it's not so much supernatural as it's a creature who probably underwent a scientific protocol that was written down in a way that it made it look like an occult ceremony. It's science being passed as esoteric knowledge. And I mean, even historically, you could argue that there's a fine line between spirituality and science. Lovecraft was himself, like I said, he was an atheist, but he does play around with that very fuzzy line at times. So yeah, and there's this, I will read out the quote later on, but there's a quote in there about the fact that, contrarily to Markham, who said science actually protects people from learning about the spiritual truth. As they get more materialistic, they get further and further away from all the demonic, witchy crap. In the case of Lovecraft, he says, the further science advances, the closer we are to getting to these horrific cosmic entities who will destroy our minds and perhaps our civilizations as well. The approach is flipped in a way, but I think that's what makes it interesting. Now, like I said, there's a slight sub-theme, I think, is about generational trauma, or at least, like generational curses. The theme of carrying skeletons in the family closet, and what exactly is it that you inherit from your ancestors. It's a theme you find in a lot of literary fiction, obviously. So here it has a cosmic horror twist. But I mean, yeah, that's a theme. Like all these stories that feature a last member of the family who has to reckon with the messed up stuff his ancestors have done and the creepy practices they had, and then basically being destroyed by them. And finally, I'm coming back to this, but I really do think it's an important sub-theme, is this sense of alienation, of deep alienation experienced by most of the characters, and I think by the author himself, of feeling detached from the universe, because the universe ultimately is so weird and terrifying that there's no safe haven, there's nowhere to turn to. A lot of the characters say the only peace I can find is in the oblivion of death. And I guess that's the point, since he was an atheist and he believed that there was absolutely nothing after death. The plug is pulled and it goes black, and that's that. Well, that also means that there are no demons to follow you, there's no hell, there's no negative spiritual reality, there's nothing to torment your soul for all eternity either. So a lot of these characters are haunted by the knowledge they've acquired, by the creepy things that go bump in the night, and so the only escape they have is blowing their brains out. And that's really freaking depressing. I mean, I think the guy was, like I said, he was a sad sack, miserable sod, who had pretty hateful opinions as well. I think he genuinely felt alienated from the universe, but also from others around it. Or, I mean, at least that's the characters he wrote about. That's how they appear. Human beings are alone on a little rock in space, hurtling in the void, at the mercy of these greater cosmic creatures that basically play football with our planet, metaphorically. We're alone. There are no good forces. I mean, sometimes they're not specifically evil, those forces he describes, but they're just so terrifying and incomprehensible to human beings that it amounts to the same thing, right? Once you know these things, you can't go back to a normal life, so you're disconnected from every other human being who still lives in blissful ignorance. Now, yeah, it's a very sad vibe. Cold, despairing alienation is definitely a running theme. Which, I mean, does help to make the whole thing feel so creepy and uncomfortable, makes your skin crawl, and which was kind of the point of me reading this, but yeah, it's definitely there. So despite what I've just talked about, I know it sounds very negative, but it is horror. This is kind of the point. And I think this is an excellent collection. I gave this 4 stars out of 5 on Goodreads in my own rating system. It's a solid 8 out of 10. I would probably read another of these anthologies because there's one story I really want to read, which is the Dunwich Horror. And I think actually the collection that has it also has the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, which is one of the weirdest stories I've heard about / read about, so I'll probably get that collection at least. There's a third one, but I'll start with the second one. It's all by the same curator. A quick note on the edition. I would strongly recommend this Penguin Modern Classics edition. There's an introduction, and there's also a crap ton of references at the end of the book to go with each story to, give context to some of the expressions used, to point to references, so some of the authors that have influenced Lovecraft, such as, like I said, Edgar Allan Poe, Arthur Machen, and someone named Algernon Blackwood, and, biographical notes, etc. So yeah, I would recommend if you're into cosmic horror genre. I'm not even a fan of horror. In general, I've never read much horror, but Lovecraft really intrigued me thanks to this person I mentioned, Quinn from the channel Quinn's Ideas, because he says that there are a lot of Lovecraftian influences in Song of Ice and Fire, and actually, I saw a lot of them in this. I was like, oh god, that's in Song of Ice and Fire. Like, he lifted that straight out of Lovecraft, so that was a lot of fun. So thanks to Quinn for introducing me to Lovecraft, because I really enjoyed myself there. And I mentioned this, I will be reading a few quotes from the book, and also one which is a famous Lovecraft quote, but I had to write it down in my quote diary. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. Sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but someday the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality, and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. It was just a colour out of space, a frightful messenger from unformed realms of infinity beyond all nature as we know it, from realms whose mere existence stuns the brain and numbs us with the black extra-cosmic gulfs it throws open before our frenzied eyes. Where does madness leave off and reality begin? Is it possible that even my latest fear is sheer delusion? And that concludes my review of The Call of Cthulhu. That's not actually how it's supposed to be pronounced, but the official pronunciation is too difficult for me, so I'm going to stick to good old Cthulhu. The Call of Cthulhu and Other Weird Stories by none other than the great, but sad, and not so nice H.P. Lovecraft. I thoroughly enjoyed this reading experience. Like I said, I will probably at some point read, I think the name of the particular edition I have in mind is like The Thing on the Doorstep and Other Weird Stories. But yeah, it does contain the Dunwich Horror and the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. So that will be planned for sometime in the future. Please share your thoughts with me. Have you read Lovecraft recently? Are you a long-time fan of Lovecraft? I know there are lots of those out there. Have you never read him but are now interested in doing so? I'd be happy to discuss. And next time I will be doing a review of Kraken by China Mieville. Until then, I hope you all have a lovely day or evening. I shall see you in the next video. Bye.